But yeah, we are back once again, and this time we did have a super special guest that we did do an interview for, but we did have some technical issues. Stephen, what were they?
Well, I'll say this. Let's go back. Let's do a weather report. Let's go back
Mm,
a few weeks ago when we recorded this, and of course, up the top, we talked to the wonderful Alexandra Heller-Nicholas. She was amazing. She's an author. She's a film critic. She does a little bit of everything. Of course, she's a contributor. She's done many commentaries, and so she was wonderful. And unfortunately, the conversation got cut a little short. We tried to keep it going, but the internet would not work with me.
yeah, it would not
So
cooperate. And what is the sad part of it all is we were right there towards the end
it,
of our conversation. Like we were
yeah,
within
maybe 10 minutes.
within reaching distance, like 10 minutes left, maybe. We were settling towards the landing.
Yeah, we were almost there. I had a couple more things I wanted to talk about, and we would probably been done. But that's just how it goes. I mean, it's the first time we've really had this. I mean, we've lost an episode before. We don't want to bring that up again, but we haven't typically had issues like this. So it sucks when it happens. But the weather was causing there to be glitches in the internet, so it just wasn't happening that night.
Right.
But one thing I do want to bring up, that kind of, I guess you could say, kind of puts a close out of that conversation in a way, is I never got a chance to bring up in our conversation one of her latest books that I have right here, 1000 Women in Horror. Really cool book. I haven't had a chance to go through the whole thing yet, but it's a great reference book to all different, all actresses and filmmakers throughout history in film. Here's one right here. Just turn right to it. Raw, which is something she did some
Rather
work on.
recent.
Yeah.
She actually, yeah, we talked a little bit, kind of in the later part where that didn't get recorded
Yeah.
about her contribution to the Blu-ray of Raw that came out in Australia, actually,
Yeah.
that I actually have on my shelf somewhere. Now that I look off into the distance, and coincidentally, that you said that, like she actually
Yeah. Well,
contributed to that movie,
we
and
got that.
she interviewed the director at like
Yeah.
a festival.
Yeah. We got that recording. So
Oh, we did.
it's
See, I don't even know what we got, what we didn't get.
yeah, because when I left the conversation trying to figure out what was going on, it still was recording your part of it. So we still got you and Alexander Heller. So there will be parts of this conversation near the end where it's just Andrew and Alexandra just talking about film a little bit. So it kind of goes away from the natural conversation we were having to more of a just you, Andrew, and her, just talking about movies. So it's abrupt, but it's still talking film, and they're still having a good conversation. So we apologize that it doesn't, when we apologize to Alexandria, sorry it didn't finish properly, but I think there's still a lot of great stuff in this conversation.
Oh yeah, it
For you.
went for over an hour already, so there's
Yeah,
plenty
yeah,
of content there.
yeah,
Fantastic guest, incredibly well versed in the specialty that she gets
yeah.
into and all kinds of stuff. And like we've said during it, if you own or have been collecting a lot of boutique labels over the last several years, you probably have her work already in your collection. And
Tons
you
of it,
may not even know it.
tons of it. So with that said, here is the conversation with Miss Alexandra Heller-Nicholas. So with us this week is award-winning author, just everything, author, writer, visual essay contributor to so many of the labels that we love, and that is Alexandra Heller-Nicholas. How you doing?
Hi, Tim. I'm good. How are you guys?
Oh, just wonderful. We're glad to get you on. I've been talking to you for a little bit, and I'm glad to finally have you on here. I'm a big fan. Love the work you do. With your visual essays or your audio commentaries, and the work you've done with like Fangoria and things like that. I just big fan. So
Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice.
Yeah, it's been I feel like ever since the beginning of this podcast, we've known of you and a lot of other people within your realm. Like Kat Ellinger, we knew from the very beginning, and you just the names keep showing up so much. So for those of you listening, chances are if you've been listening to this podcast, if you've been collecting these boutique labels for the last couple of years, chances are you know who Alexandra Heller-Nicholas is, and if you don't, hopefully you will now. You
Oh,
know,
you're gonna know her now. We're gonna get into we're gonna
I'm
you're
not
gonna
going to
know.
shut up. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's what we've had talkers on, and they always like to apologize. And I said, you're here to talk. Just
yeah,
don't worry
Anything
about
for
that.
dead air. Yep.
it's better
Yeah,
to talk than not to
please.
talk. You know, when it comes to
Yes.
this, it
There'll be
makes our
times
job
when we're
easier.
yeah, there'll be times when me and Andrew are talking Blu-ray announcements, and Andrew will get like fixated on reading something on his screen, and I'm like, Andrew, you were just talking and you stopped. I'm like, you can't just do that.
Mid sentence,
Yeah, and then I'm
He
like,
was having a
dude,
moment. He was just having a little
Well,
moment. Andrew,
yeah,
you're allowed your
yeah.
moments.
thank you, thank you.
It's all
Glad
right.
somebody acknowledges it.
Don't encourage him. Don't encourage him. But of course, yeah, wonderful to have you here. And so in general, how you doing? How's everything going right now with you? I know it's the middle of the day in Australia.
It is. It's the weekend here, so I think for you guys it's Friday evening, but for me it's well into Saturday. So yeah, I'm in weekend mode. I'm chilling. I'm
Well,
relaxed.
I could see with the ears you're partying. You're partying.
Right.
Partying.
These are the
Yeah.
these are the weekend headphones. You know,
I like
I've
them.
got my
Yeah.
work headphones off, got the weekend headphones on.
Nice. So, what's a typical way? Do you have a lot of work that you have to work through the weekend in usually, or do you usually actually have some days off?
No, I've been working from home or working for myself easily for God over 20 years now. So I'm very strict on weekends
Yeah.
and not working outside of work hours. So I have a very rigid, very strongly policed because if you don't, you just don't stop working. I think people think
Yeah.
that if you work from home, it's like a kind of holiday. I guess that's all changed since lockdown. But for me, yeah, like I've got a very long sort of decades plus history of knowing that, yeah, you need weekends. You need to
Yeah.
make a point. I think even in my work email signature, it's like I don't answer emails on weekends and I'm in an Australian time zone. So if I don't reply, don't take it personally. But yeah,
Yeah.
you have
Yeah.
to be your own cop. All cops are
Yeah.
bad, but you have to be your own cop. I don't know
Yeah.
how that works.
Yeah. I mean, I've noticed this. This is a thing I've noticed with some of the other people we've scheduled with, had on the show, and yeah, sometimes they'll be like, "Yeah, I can only do things at this time because there's family time. There's
Yep.
so a lot of times people only will want to schedule during what they consider work hours and not any other time. So and we get it. I'm doing for me. I mean, a lot of our availability to do the show is about my time because Andrew, I have a family, so and Andrew's a single guy, so he's kind of got a little bit more time, he's flexible. Me, I'm not. So now I kind of have to do it basically in the times I would sleep is when we
Yeah.
got to do our
Yep.
show. So that's we do but we love this stuff, and luckily my wife is supportive and allows me to spend some time down here in the basement doing this thing. And but yes, so please, as we always like to do, we like to go back to the beginnings and talk about where that love of film started for you. Did it start from when you were first born? Because I believe that's where it has to start. Like, where were you born?
So I'm from Melbourne,
Yeah.
which is right down the bottom of Australia. It's just above. There's a little island down the bottom called Tasmania. I'm not from Tasmania, just slightly above that. So we're the second biggest city outside of
Yeah.
Sydney, and we're better than Sydney. I'm allowed to say that. We have a kind of LA, New York thing going on, but it's very parochial. And I found out just a few years ago before my mother died, she mentioned in passing that I was 7 weeks old when I saw The Exorcist in the cinema, which
Ooh.
I obviously didn't remember. But she said, "Yeah, do you think that's got anything to do with your interest in horror?" And it's like, I think it might. Like,
Well, it makes me feel better that you saw something that traumatic that early and it didn't mess you up because my daughter's already seen some crazy shit.
my son too. Yep.
Yeah. So because I got to watch stuff for the show. So I'm putting on these like really like, I think I even put one of your films that you did a work on, Thriller, was playing
Hey,
in the
wow.
room with her in the room. And I'm like, I'm sorry, girl, this is what I'm watching.
My son had seen all of Marble Hornets before he was talking, and I think Slender Man was like one of his first 10 words, and I'm
Ooh, that's
oddly
a good
proud
one.
of that.
That's a good one to really just mess you up. Yeah.
Yeah. But look, I mean, I come from a very working class background. My parents didn't have a lot of money, and they were sort of voracious consumers of art, both high and low brow. And it's something that I don't think I appreciated till I was much older. But, we would go to free art exhibitions, we would go to free museums, and we would watch a huge amount of movies, just tons and tons of movies. So I grew up, in retrospect, which was quite a rigorous film boot camp. And I hated it when I was a kid. My friends were watching like Bachelor Party and Police Academy, and I wanted to watch those films. But no, I have to watch a Hitchcock marathon with my mum, and
Ugh.
tons of musicals, tons of westerns. My dad was really into stuff like Rafifi. I remember that was one of the
Mm.
first films I watched with my dad all the way through, was Jules Dassin's Rafifi. And when I was a kid, it's like, I want to do a Nightmare on Elm Street, marathon with my friends. I don't want to watch these old movies. But yeah, in retrospect, it was a gift. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm very hugely, I mean, very much the cinephile, and not just film, but the kind of consumer of books and other kind of music and painting, all kinds of different art. I definitely get directly from my parents, and a very rigid regime of exposure to an amazingly diverse kind of world of art from a really young age.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that I think watching, I mean, and this isn't necessarily for all films that are older films as we call them, but like I'd say for the most part, because the whole fast editing happened a little later on, and I think it would be good for kids to watch these, especially these days, watch older films, because it teaches patience and
Yeah,
teaches like paying attention to the story and the characters and the things that are happening more than trying to get to the point. Like I feel like a lot of kids they're trying to, it's like they're trying to get the movie done, like, and I'm
yeah,
like, or they're trying to figure it out before it's happened. And I'm like, like just let the movie follow the way the story's been told. Let the movie take you on the journey. Like don't,
Mm.
and that's
The attention
yeah,
spans are shorter
yeah.
now. I just think from every perspective, not even just young people. I think just our whole culture and society is so fast
A lot of
paced.
information coming
big
at us
time.
all the time. Yeah.
Yep.
Especially here in the US. I think the benefit of us, having a lot of guests from, other geographical areas of the world is it's different cultures have different sense of the way in which their society moves. The US, everything is extremely fast paced depending on where you live. If you live on an East Coast, urban area and a West Coast urban area, it's fast paced, always moving. More rural areas, much slow down. But when it comes to entertainment's gotta keep you going,
Well,
gotta
I think
keep your heart
everybody's
rate going.
inundated with entertainment. It's the, I mean, I hate to use this word distraction, but a lot of
Mm,
it's a distraction. I mean,
Yeah.
that's why it's important to really, try to, that's why we like these labels and things. Like I feel like we're getting a nice curation, and you're getting kind of to look past a lot of the noise. Yeah,
And it kind of encourages an immersion,
yeah,
which is what I like about doing this work from the other side of the fence. It's, you can completely immerse yourself in the world of a film.
hmm,
Um, and that's almost the opposite of what we get elsewhere, which is a kind of surface brush over a
yep,
lot of content. And home entertainment's almost the opposite, where it's like a deep, 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 deep dive that is wholly immersive into one text.
yeah.
it's
No, yeah,
difficult, I would say it's difficult to immerse yourself wholly into one thing at one time in one place. I think that's why, the cinematic experience is rather unique, or theatrical experience, or going to a Broadway show or a musical and stuff like that. Like all of that is so unique because you're so immersed in it. It's difficult to replicate that at home.
Big
Um,
time.
depending on your setup in your area, I'm fortunate enough to where, and I've mentioned it many times here on the show, where I watch films late at night. I find it very comforting to watch films past midnight when there's no one around you to distract you. It's interesting watching an Alfred Hitchcock film at 3 in the morning. Now that you mentioned Hitchcock, because it's quite an immersive journey. Watching North by Northwest at 3 a.m. is different than watching it at 3 in the afternoon with the sun blaring through your windows.
yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that that's something that we've talked about a lot on this show, is just, um, trying to get people back to caring about the film's past, just kind of like an escapism.
Yep.
And I think that's how it was, growing up. I felt like movies were still something that, people cared about a little bit more. I mean, I think it's just the fact that it's so much of it now that I think it gets taken for granted, a lot. And but going back to your beginnings, what are some of the films that really were kind of like the foundational things that started getting you into like wanting to learn more about the behind the scenes and all that kind of stuff?
I was really lucky in that the school that I went to I'm not sure what the American equivalent is. So my final years of high school, the last two final years of high school, um, we had a film studies course.
Mhm.
And we just had an amazing teacher. And again, like I'm old enough that some of the stuff we watched was on video. You know, the old trolleys that they would reel into classrooms with the big tube
Oh yeah.
TVs but we had an amazing teacher who was really insistent on film. So I saw Citizen Kane for the first time on film, on a film
Wow.
print.
That's
And
fantastic.
she was really formative for me. She was her name was Claire. She was a really hugely formative influence. So things like The Draftsman's Contract by Peter Greenaway, Little Murders, the Alan Arkin film.
Yep.
There's quite random in a way. Citizen Kane was obviously quite a big one, seeing that on a film print. Things like The Blue Angel. So yeah, stuff that I saw at school. But in having this teacher who was so fastidious about showing us things on film, which when you
Yeah.
think now for a high school to be showing these kinds of movies on film is insane, right?
I
So
would
I was
I would
gifted,
assume you were lying if somebody
right?
told me that. Yeah.
Well, it's like,
Right.
yeah, how do you even
And she was like, you're either going to watch Citizen Kane on film, or you're not going to watch it at all.
yeah, how
Mm.
does one even acquire, film now? In terms of like
Right.
trying to get a film print of Citizen Kane is probably more
Hmm.
difficult now than it was, then. Now they pretty much just show you the DVD or the Blu-ray, or I mean, if you have
Absolutely.
access to the 4K, go with that, I guess.
Yeah. So
Um,
I was really lucky, like hugely lucky. And this was just a public school. This was just, the local high school. So it wasn't like a particularly fancy school or an art school or anything like that. This was just sort of the school that was free, that was in my area.
I kind of
Um,
want to. I kind of. I've. Not that I'm like. I'm not an academic. I'm not like you, Alexandra. I don't have film study. I don't have any degrees or anything. But I have thought about the fact that I love movies so much that I would love to share it with younger people. And I've always thought about being like Jack Black in School of Rock and going into some school somewhere and taking over a classroom and then start teaching them about movies and getting them all into movies. And then we make a movie together. That's just been
that's awesome. Look,
I know that should, yeah, it
sorry.
should be a movie. It should be a movie.
I'm very elastic, I guess, when it comes to the subject of sort of formal education, when it comes to film theory and film history, at least. So as I
Yeah,
said, I come from a working class background, so going to university was a really big deal for me and for my family.
yeah,
So I did my master's, I did a PhD, um, but yeah, like I don't want to sound anti-intellectual, but
no,
for me personally, yeah, it was important for me to get those things, but I call myself a recovering academic. Um, and I find that like I don't work in universities anymore. I was quite happy to leave them, to be honest. I don't know about other places, but in Australia, it's a pretty toxic industry. And I mean, I guess because I come from a journal, like a film journalism or journalism background, more broadly, it was sort of like I'm not getting to talk to the people that I want to talk to
yeah,
about film. I don't want to talk to 60-year-old professors. I want to talk to 16-year-old kids about
yeah.
this
I mean,
stuff. So
60-year-olds are already got their mind made up about a lot of
right,
things.
and
Yeah,
yeah, I
Very
found,
true.
for me personally, universities were very restrictive, and
yeah,
I don't regret it,
Yeah,
but I
that's
think a lot of my own kind of class baggage had to do with me,
yeah,
and
and
me kind of pursuing that track. Yeah,
I noticed that on your website, which is for people who wanna know more about you and more about all the archive of your work, is the bluelenses.com, right?
that's right.
That's right. Okay, I got it right. And it does say recovering academic, and I'm glad you brought that up because to define that, it could be interpreted in several different ways, but it is very interesting how I mean we see this all the time. There are different I don't know schools of thought, areas, breakdowns, whatever of cinema and all this kind of stuff. Some people treat it as this intellectual ideal thing where they get very studious about it, very elite about it, where like only certain films are should be recognized as great or recognized with certain, accommodation and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's where the whole academic of it all, like you were saying, the whole studious of it, when you talk about film theory and breakdowns and all this kind of stuff, you kind of you elevate it almost up to a pedestal level, and you forget about all of the richness that's
Yep.
that's behind it all, or that's left that you're not studying. And I feel like, academically, when people go to film school, which everyone can take their own path towards cinema, but I think film school and kind of formal education in and of itself, just as a whole, is incredibly stunting when it comes to one's, I think, growth as a person. There's a lot of things they don't teach you in school that you probably need to know, and that can also be said about movies.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. I mean, I think for filmmaking, like to go to a practical, to go to film school, that's one thing, and that's something that I've not done. So I'm not talking about that side of things personally. I'm
Mm,
talking about like the film history, film theory, film kind of the more kind of critical engagement. Um, yeah, I mean, and it was really formative for me. I had hugely influential lecturers and tutors who most of who are still friends or I'm in contact with. Um, but I mean, there is, yeah, for me personally, it was really important to avoid what I see in some people, which is this sort of restrictive idea of like, film is not for you, cinema is not for you. And I don't see, I sort of passionately rally against that. Like I will put in the same amount of passion and thought to, a straight to video release from Vinegar Syndrome as I would something, like a more highbrow art
Yeah.
film. Like
mm,
I just can't. I cannot tolerate that kind of and it's usually very class driven, and it's usually very ego driven, which I think why people like Kat Ellinger, Lee Gambin, um, obviously Kayla Janice is like a really key person here. There's so many people that I'm not mentioning,
Oh, yeah, of course. It's a ton. Yeah.
but that it's about opening a film up. And it's like, hey, come and play in the muck of this with me.
Yeah.
And that spirit is beautiful, and I think it's really there's passion and there's intelligence and there's joy. And the opposite of that is when somebody's being very performative, and it's like, let me tell you about what the things that you don't know, like this sort of patronizing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and unfortunately a lot of that is governed by university accreditations that I think are kind of, having a doctor in front of my name, I can kind of say it's kind of bullshit. Like
Yeah.
for me personally, I don't know. I don't mean, yeah, I'm conscious that I might sound anti-intellectual. I'm not anti-intellectual, I'm anti-asshole.
mm,
Well, I was gonna say,
yeah,
what you got to understand about that kind of attitude, being an asshole like that, about being elitist like that. What it does is it turns people off of the thing that you want to teach them about. Like
eh,
people
yeah,
don't like people trying to tell them what they like,
100%.
what they should like or don't like. They want to be able to discover it for themselves, and the only way to do that is to give them as much of it as possible and let them decide for themselves. And that hurts the whole thing. And even not even just in the academic, learning about the history of things, but also in filmmaking itself. The more we try to teach people what we think filmmaking should be like, I think it's good to learn the basics, but then from there you got to let them be creative and let them make mistakes
Yeah.
and make their own choices, because even things that as we always say, film is subjective. So it's even what we think as my personal taste might be the wrong move in a story or something. Years later, that thing could be reevaluated and people are like, what, that was really awesome. Like it's just ever changing. There's so many of these things coming out on physical media that people were like, reviving, and now they're saying, well, maybe this was a damn masterpiece, and like that's the kind of, it's
yeah,
unfortunately we can't be open like that all the time. And
Mhm.
sometimes films are not made at the right time, and
Yeah.
they just need time. And that's why I tell
Mhm.
people when I got, I hate to shout him out here and make him feel bad, but friend of mine, Dan Skip Allen,
mm,
he's a film critic in Florida. And when he's like, he really loves a movie, he wants to give it like a high rating. I'm like, dude, calm down. It's like, give it some time. Don't give it 5 stars after the first time you watched it, man. Like, calm down, like, so it's like, I think everything needs some
there's a lot
seasoning,
of
needs some
passion.
time,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
movies are ever evolving, I think, I think we're as generations go on and as like people grow, society changes, reevaluation happens. Past films get looked at in different contexts and different lights and different interpretations. I think we've seen that a lot when it comes to our modern culture. A lot of what was acceptable to be put on film back in the 1950s, let's just say, is something that's probably not acceptable now. And we have to discuss why that is. We have to
Yeah.
discuss, certain racial things, certain misogynistic things, certain, interpretations of what was going on at the time back then, and maybe how it relates to now, maybe how it doesn't relate to now. And I mean, I think a lot of those things are open, and a lot of those people, unfortunately, a lot of people don't want to have those conversations because they want to be stuck in terms of one interpretation of the movie at the way
Yeah,
it's always been looked at. Something like Gone with the Wind, has gotten reevaluations over time in terms of being kind of glorifying certain eras of the Civil War that probably shouldn't be glorified, but then people get caught up in, oh, but it's a magical film from in Technicolor from the 30s, and it's such a classic, and we can have both discussions and
I
interpret it different
agree.
ways.
I agree so strongly. I feel really passionate about this. I think that we live in a time, unfortunately, where there is an increase in um, a film can be dismissed as quote unquote problematic as a way of shutting down conversation.
Hmm.
Um, and to me, that's the worst thing that can happen. What I think is really important is that films can be both. I mean, I hate terms like this, but these sort of reductive, it can be problematic and progressive at the same time. And that's why I think directors like Brian De Palma, Dario Argento are so interesting, because you look at some of their films and some of the stuff is really progressive. And then some of the stuff, you're kind of doing some pretty intense, rhetorical gymnastics to sort of
Hmm.
defend stuff.
Yeah.
And that's okay. A film can be both. A filmmaker can be both. We can have those conversations. It's not a fucking football. Sorry, can I swear? It's not a
Yeah.
football
Of course
team,
you can.
right? You don't need to sort of, you don't need to barrack. You don't need to be, yeah, you don't need to go for filmmakers like they're a sports team.
Yeah.
You can love their films and say, you know what, I can't reconcile this aspect of their work. And I'm not going to try to, because it sits poorly with me, and I'm okay with that. And it's not about, and like you said, it's about opening conversation up rather than shutting it down. And a lot of the films that I deal with, especially, I've written a couple of books on rape revenge film, and I often get called upon to do
Hmm.
commentaries, video essays, and things for films that kind of deal not just even rape revenge, but things that deal with gendered violence. Um, and it's a really difficult thing to talk about. And these films are so important to get those conversations going. And more often than not, these films are precisely like I've said, that they have stuff in them that's really like, oh shit, that's a bit much. That
Yeah.
doesn't sit well with me. But at the same time, they might have things that are progressive. And we just need to develop a kind of a critical palette, I guess, or a pretty critical toolbox to be able to say a film can be two things at once.
Yeah.
And we don't
Exactly.
have to kind of reject it, but we don't have to embrace it. We need to sort of relax into it, I guess, and just sit with our tensions and sit with those. And sometimes it's hypocrisy, like, I mean, there's some filmmakers that I cannot separate the art from the artist. I cannot. And I've gone on very difficult journeys with some filmmakers who were hugely influential for me, whose work I can no longer watch. But
Yeah.
there are other people who I know, are objectively terrible people, and I just don't have that problem with.
Yeah.
And yes, it's absolutely hypocritical, and all I can do is sit with that hypocrisy,
Yeah. I mean, it's a choice.
and just sort
Everybody's
of
got choice.
recognize it and identify it for what it is. And it's like, yeah, I'm a hypocrite and I
Yeah.
can't defend it, but that's,
There
I'd
are
rather do that than try to sort of justify an objectively horrible person who's making movies. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
there's an open way I feel that you can both acknowledge a filmmaker as being great at their craft, but also being a terrible person at the same time,
Well, and I think
or
it's
doing terrible
also,
things.
yeah,
And
and I think
I
it,
think it's personal. Sometimes that bleeds through into how
yeah,
you watch a text, and sometimes you can suspend that, and I think it's more intuitive. I don't think that's an intellectual process. I think that's just something that you bring from your own life to the experience of watching a given movie.
yeah.
Mm.
I think it's also important to remember that tons of other people are making these movies too. It's not, yeah, the director is usually the main person that gets the credit for everything on a movie, but there's actors, there's behind the scenes people, editors and things that worked really hard on something that they all believed in. And that's the thing, that you got to also remember too, that you're not
100%. I have a friend that calls Rosemary's Baby William Castle's Rosemary's Baby.
Nice.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. It's the same way we feel about the physical media. That's why we bring, people like you on, people, just contributors, because not only are we buying them for the movies, but the people behind the releases, the friends from Radiance, you and Kat Ellinger, and just tons of, Chris O'Neill, we just recently had, just people like that are what make these things, extra better. And we know, knowing that you guys are behind them, just makes it more enjoyable. And so, yeah, I mean, like you said,
that's awesome.
Yeah. I'm glad that we just want you guys to know that, because I think
it's lovely. That's
it's
really
important
nice.
for everybody. It's important for everybody to be reminded that the work that they're doing is important. And
yeah, it's very more noticed now, I think, than ever before, because I think there's more recognition now, and I feel like there should be more recognition. I think on our most recent episode, I was hoping that cover artists get more recognition. Like, tell me who did this cover art, this original cover art. Some companies say it, some don't. You kind of have to do your own research on that. A lot of it comes down to them having to promote their own work, which a lot of freelance people have to do. They have to, be their own marketers, I guess, through Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever the case may be, websites. What is interesting is, uh, touching upon, just going back a little bit, you've written a couple of books about the whole rape revenge thing that happens in a lot of films, horror films. What is so interesting about that, it being such a hot button issue, I would say, with a lot of people and a lot of people discussing a lot of these films. What I find so interesting about kind of that whole concept and idea is it keeps recurring. Like, it's been around for decades.
It's been around for centuries. It's in the
centuries,
Bible.
you're right.
It's in the Bible.
It's in the
It's
Bible,
Old Testament. It's
I was just thinking
Boudica.
movie-wise.
Like, it's a really almost primal story.
And it's almost as if, like, these entertainment, whether it be books, whether it be movies, TV, of course, why does it keep recurring? I mean, I like, instead of shutting down the discussion like we were talking about,
Yeah.
because it's such a disturbing thing, opening up as to, like, why is it such a thing that's told in stories over and over again, and audience from every generation keep coming back to it, like you just said, for centuries. And
I think as far as sort of, I mean, I'm sort of paraphrasing like a lot of other critics that have, and academics and scholars who have written on this. I think one of the rape is a very useful tool to talk about other things. It's often employed. So if somebody, think about like an episode of Law and Order SVU or something like that. If somebody's murdered, it's terrible. If somebody's raped and murdered, it's worse. So rape is almost like a highlighter pen. And in terms of the kind of of telling a moral tale, rape is often employed to amplify a distinction between quite clear-cut differences between good and evil. Very, very simplistic terms, because sometimes it's appropriate to murder somebody. I'm not saying that I have, and I'm not saying you should, but you know what I mean? Like
I know what you mean.
There
Like
are situations.
Death Wish, where his whole family is killed in front of him, and then he's like,
not something. You might steal a loaf of bread to feed your family, so theft isn't always morally bad. Rape is always bad. It's always bad.
There's no accident there.
Right. Yeah. There's no reason why it's you need to feed your family. So, it doesn't fit into that. So it's a very useful narrative device to be crude. And often it's employed as a kind of brute force moralizing tool. So there's not necessarily films that feature sexual violence aren't necessarily telling stories or having an opinion of or engaging with the discourse surrounding sexual violence, which is quite a weird thing to think about. It's such a blanket thing. And when we get to rape revenge, we have this, that kind of moral structure is in the name. There is a rape,
Yeah.
there is revenge.
Yeah,
Um,
there's a built-in moral justification for the violence that
Yeah.
comes after this.
Exactly. But what I find so interesting is, I mean, I've seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these films, is that within that equation, the rape and revenge, there is an extraordinarily diverse ways, there is an extraordinary range of ways to address those issues, and to present them and to reflect on them. And for better or for worse, rape revenge films, I think, are wanting to start a conversation, or whether consciously or not, they're starting conversations or prompting conversations about gendered violence that are desperately needed and that most of us avoid at most times. There's
Yeah.
a myth about rape revenge films that that they're obviously that they're offensive. These are really challenging films to watch, and there are plenty that are really on the nose, like that are really kind of stinky in
I
terms of
mean,
their kind of overt exploitative intent.
Irreversible is pretty rough. Irreversible. I mean, it's not a revenge, but it's definitely. Well, I guess it is kind of a rape revenge.
Yeah, well, Irreversible's a great. I've got my Irreversible shirt on. Irreversible's a great example because what it does is so simple in that it takes the rape revenge equation and makes it revenge rape.
Yeah.
And we see that the mechanics of what is going on there, we see that in the recent straight cut of Irreversible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what that film does is, by simply flipping the story around, it forces us to address the issues of, what is the relationship of revenge to rape? What happens if we see the revenge first?
Mm-hmm.
How does that? So that's a really complicated film.
Yeah, does it change your perspective on the revenge? Like, does it feel more justified to you, or is it still killing somebody still a bad thing?
And what I find so interesting about rape revenge is this, this highbrow, lowbrow distinction that we've talked about. We go back to, I mean, one of the earliest rape revenge films won an Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film, which is Virgin Spring by Ingmar Bergman.
Yeah.
Very close to that, the very first episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents is called Revenge, and it's a rape revenge story.
Yes,
we think of it as being a horror thing, but Westerns were doing rape revenge long before Last House on the Left or I Spit on Your Grave. There's a really deep, long tradition in Westerns, which are related to, things like captivity narratives. Great films like The Bravados with Gregory Peck is, an immediate one that comes to mind. So, yeah, like the politics of a film isn't necessarily related to whether it's an exploitation film or a kind of highbrow art film or something in between, something like The Accused or Thelma and Louise, which play with the ideas of rape revenge. I don't think that they're straightforward rape revenge films, but they play with they sort of tinker with the politics of it.
Yeah.
It's a really complicated area. And when I go to film festivals, or when I do public speaking things, I used to be really surprised, and now I'm not, in that I always have people come up afterwards and say, look, I'm a survivor. I really love these films. Is there something wrong with me? So, I think that there's an assumption that a lot of people who are survivors are really, these are too much, and that's totally valid. But there is a lot of people, and the one thing I really want to say is it's not just women. I've had men talk to me about this stuff that I know I've never talked to anybody else. And these are strangers. And I guess because I am a stranger. But there are filmmakers who are survivors who make rape revenge films. So it's a really complicated film that I think is far too often, it's a textbook case of that people rush. I don't like rape revenge films. They're really offensive. And it's like, well, yes, like I'm not going to argue with that. But it's like you're dealing with a whole broad spectrum of stuff here.
It's incredibly nuanced. Unfortunately, as time has gone on, it's become incredibly close to real life. It's become incredibly contemporary. We just mentioned a few films that came out decades upon decades ago, but they're dealing with contemporary things because oftentimes film can be a reflection of our society, and unfortunately, these things like sexual violence, assault, rape, and all these things keep recurring within our society, and the art keeps reflecting that, but society never seems to learn from it, really. If anything, things are worse now than ever before because there's so much more open discussion about it, really. Open discussion in the sense, like, every time someone comes out with an allegation of sexual assault or whatever the case may be from decades ago, that person's immediately attacked for a nuance of things like, why didn't you come out at the time? Why'd you wait so long? Why this and that? And it's like, and then you begin to realize no wonder why they didn't want to talk about this in the first place,
Of
because
course.
the discussion around it is so toxic and so awful, and it keeps recurring no matter the decades. And you said it is not just, specifically towards women, but also towards men, and it's more of a societal thing now than I think a specific gender thing. I don't know if that's accurate to
No, I
say.
think that's and it's cross-cultural as well.
Yes.
Like it's I mean, I've seen rape revenge films from Japan, from Turkey, from all over the world, all over the world. Really rich tradition in a lot of South American cinemas, national cinemas. Argentine rape revenge film is incredibly intense and incredibly
Mm.
interesting.
And
And the way that it sort of hooks into these sort of national contexts or these national discourses. Yeah, I mean, they're fantasy films. They're justice fantasies. That's
Yeah.
what these films are. And when you frame them like that, that actually becomes quite chilling.
Yeah.
It's like this is the only way that we can sort of and I know BJ Colangelo, who's one of my favorite people in the world, also one of my favorite critics in the world. She wrote an incredible piece about rape revenge films and being a survivor, and it was precisely because of this. Films like Miss 45, I Spit on Your Grave. It was precisely because of this fantasy aspect, this revenge fantasy aspect, that helped her move on.
Yeah. I was gonna
It's
say
and
it can be cathartic for people. It can be something that
yeah,
helps them feel like that they're seen and that their feelings are real, and
Yep.
it really does help people. I think of you were
yeah,
talking about how there's films about rape that are not always about the revenge part of it, and one film you worked on, and I think Andrew picked it up at the same time I thought about it, was Outrage.
Oh, you saw me pick it up? Yeah, I thought
Yeah,
I was sneaky.
yeah,
throwing up the goats for Ida Lupino.
I
yes,
know.
yes,
I
definitely,
love Ida Lupino. I'm trying to get all
yeah,
of her films, and I
yeah,
needed this one
yeah,
because this is one I was missing.
this release was my introduction to the movie, and listening to your video essay, just fantastic film, and just that opening scene, the rape scene, is so chilling, and so
It's so ahead of its time. I
yeah,
mean,
way
it's
ahead of its
just
time.
Talk about
extraordinary.
contemporary and just
Yep,
coming out, in 1950 of all the decades to
right.
come out. Where
And that's 10 years before the Virgin Spring. Like,
yes,
Yeah,
I
it's
was
it's
even gonna say
insane. Like,
just
yeah,
to put it, societal, in a society context here in the U.S., the whole women's rights movement really wouldn't come around until at least another decade and a half, with the explosion of expression of rights in the 60s
mhm,
and into the 70s. So this was way ahead of its time.
yep.
Ida Lupino, just incredible work during her time. She made I don't know if Alexandra, you can probably say if she made women's pictures, but she made pictures about women, if
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
accurate to say.
they're retrospectively called women's pictures. I mean, and
Mhm.
also it's like her first few films were very much social issues films,
Right.
focused on women. Like, so unwanted pregnancy, um, things like that. So very much focused on that kind of experience, and told with just extraordinary candor. I mean, when you think about the context that Outrage was made in, she wasn't allowed to use the word rape in the film. It's not there. And
yeah,
yet she does it. It's like, and it's amazing. I do think that she often gets I don't think that she's a woman's filmmaker. I think that Outrage is actually quite radical, because Outrage is, for me, a very early example. I mean, it goes back to things like Jermaine Delac's The Seashell and the Clergyman. I've written on this elsewhere, but I think that women filmmakers have an extraordinary ability to tell stories about toxic masculinity, about men
yeah,
and toxic masculinity. So, Lynn Ramsey's You Would Never Really Hear is like a really good recent example. It's not a horror
oh yeah,
film, but I think that Lupino fits into that tradition. I think that our Hitchhiker is one of the best films about men. And I don't think there's many women characters even in that film. But yeah, the earlier films are very much focused on the sort of the lived experience of women. And Outrage is next level. I mean, there's a scene quite early on where she's the rape survivor is being interviewed by police, and she's being basically interrogated, and the whole thing is shot through like the bars of her bed, and it's a
mm,
sort of it's an old film noir trick, right? The bars to represent the prison, but it's so powerful. And you watch that scene and you think of something like The Accused, where we have similar scenes of, the idea that it's the survivor who's becoming interrogated. We see that stuff in more contemporary films, and it comes straight, from this sort of Lupino moment. I never thought that film would find a release. I cried when Imprint asked me to do the commentary, and it was very close to when Josh Nelson and I did the commentary for Morven Caller, the Lynn Ramsey film, which is another film that I never thought I would see the day that got released. So both of those films for me were real bucket list stuff, and the fact that I did them so close together.
Yeah, I was going to say,
emotional.
I was going to say that I saw that Morven Caller's one of your favorite films of all time. I saw your list come out from the
I was I mean,
sound
we were
list. Yeah,
very fortunate to have
Fun City.
Fun City on twice, and the first time he was on Jonathan Hertzberg, right, Stephen?
Yes.
I always forget all the names we have of people on. I thanked him personally for finally putting this out on Blu-ray. It was the first time ever. The only way you could find this movie was an old DVD, at least here in the US, that came out in 2002 when the movie came out, I think. It was Lynn Ramsey's first two films I had waited years for, Ratcatcher and Morven Caller. And just finally this movie got a release. I mean, I can't recommend this enough to people. And even just Lynn Ramsey's work in general. I'm just a gigantic fan of her.
The Queen.
Oh.
I'm such a huge fan of hers. Actually, this is sort of a point. I'm doing a talk at the Australian Centre for the Moving Image in a couple of weeks on women in horror, and I was just pulling this together sort of in the last 24 hours. This sort of talk that I'm giving, and one of the things that I've realised, and I don't think I've articulated it before, is not just women in horror, but women's filmmaking in general. I think that it's a discourse very much driven, understandably enough, by women, lots of women critics and women filmmakers really kind of driving this really important conversation. But behind the scenes, there are men that I admire because they would never call themselves male feminists. They're not those creepy guys, I'm a male feminist, and kind of look at your tits while they're talking to you. Those guys are bad. They're not those guys. These are guys that just put their heads down and do their job and do the work. And they're the ones who are digging up these films. They're the ones who are doing this extraordinary archival work of rescuing women's films. There was a film from Arrow called a few years ago called Cold Light of Day, which if you don't have it and you're listening to this, everybody needs to get this film. And the director of that was actually in my Women in Horror book, Fiona Louise, no surname. And there was no information about it. I think I found the film on YouTube, and I was absolutely it was like being struck by lightning. It's a serial, really raw, gritty serial killer film about Dennis Nielsen, true crime film. And there was just no information. And I'd sort of there were rumors on Cinemageddon that I'd sort of gleaned that maybe it was an alias, and maybe she died by suicide, and maybe it was the producer using a fake name. I had nothing to go on for the entry, and then Arrow released this incredible release of this film where she does a commentary and she's interviewed, and it's that's incredible archival work that is like the nuts and bolts of what we need to really champion women's filmmaking. And I don't think physical media gets the kudos that it deserves. Agfa's work on Sarah Jacobson, groundbreaking,
Doris Wishman stuff.
Yep.
Yeah. That was
and time again, Outrage and Morven Caller, these are the films. There are obviously women home entertainment producers who are doing amazing work, but I certainly don't want to diminish their presence, but it is largely a kind of male dominated industry. Just there's so many guys that I work with every day who just really quietly just get the work done, and they're not people that are sort of championed as such, and I think that they are people that would actually be quite embarrassed if I were to name them. I just want them to know that they're recognized. I know what they're doing, and I'm grateful.
I think when it's like anything, if you feel like somebody's bragging about something, or they feel the need to bring up that they're doing something that's important like that, you feel like it's insincere. So it's like if you're just doing the work because you think it needs to be done and you're not making a big deal about it, that tells me that you just care about the thing.
Right.
And
very
that's
true.
and
I've always said,
I mean,
it's like those people who call themselves a genius. Real geniuses don't call themselves genius.
Exactly.
Yeah, because they're too busy crying in bed of insecurity and all the stuff I don't know.
It's the same thing with, I mean, I would say, not a big surprise here, considering that the way our society is, but misogyny is on the rise again, and it's and people who give themselves the moniker the alpha male, real like genuine quote unquote alpha males don't refer to themselves as that. If you are, chances
Yeah.
are you're not. You know, you're kind of you're
Yep,
saying things just to make it known that you think you are or you want to
big
be.
time,
And
big
it's
time.
like the real genius is like, you know, there's one thing about gloating if you achieve something, you know, like an award or you're a top prime athlete and you're one of the best in the world and you're recognized for that. I get it, but if you're not, you're kind of, you know, I mean, I understand ego boosts, but come on, let's be real right now
It's a
here.
bit obvious, right? It's
Yeah,
sort of
don't be so
needy.
obvious.
Don't be so needy.
Yeah,
And I would say
exactly.
this is going back to kind of women in film. I think I've said this a few times here on the show. There's been a huge boost of recognition or kind of retrospective going back and assessing women's role in film history and women's roles in film in general from the very beginning. I think it's been a huge boost in terms of writing, not only from you, but writing from many other people that I've noticed online. That people going back and kind of unearthing a lot of his names. Like, and I mean, Ida Lupino people know, but you don't understand that she was one of the very few who was a woman being able to make films in the 1950s and the 1960s, where that was not the case at all.
Yep.
And it's just you really don't realize how suppressed or oppressed the women in film were at that time, um, due to the male dominated world in which it is. But it's not like they didn't want to do it; they just weren't allowed to do it. And those who did, their work wasn't as promoted as men. You know what I mean? And it's really kind of unfortunate of all of the things we probably lost because of that, and but also the things we're discovering, like in Out of the Pino, like a lot of the earlier women, with a lot of these box sets that are coming out. I keep
Yep.
bringing up um, the early pioneers women in film box set from
Incredible.
Kino,
Incredible.
which is that's education in a box. Like,
It is. It
how
is.
would you find these
That's film
films
school.
anywhere else?
That is film school. Like
Yeah, how would you find
it's
them? You
I
know?
mean, it's hard to sort of overstate how important um outrage is, because I mean there were films about that had sexual violence and had rape in them. I'm thinking of like Johnny Belinda is a really obvious one that came before it. Male directors, obviously. But I mean, even going back to, you know, Birth of a Nation, right? So it's not that that was like the first film about rape. But what Lupino did that was so important is that she set it in the present day. So
Yeah,
even something like Bergman's Virgin Spring, rape is historicized as something kind of primal and primitive and old. It doesn't happen in the
yeah,
world that we live in. Whereas Lupino was like, not only does it happen in the world that we live in, it happens in the suburbs where we live. It happens to nice
yeah,
girls. It happens to, you know, it happens to nice girls who are engaged. It it
Mm.
yeah,
it, it happens to normal people. And I mean that's radical filmmaking. Radical.
yeah. I could tell
Yeah.
you a radical film that I just recently that you were involved in that I need to watch your I believe you did a visual essay or maybe it was a commentary for this film. I think it's a Infernal Rapist, um, for Vinegar Syndrome. That's a tough movie to try to get people on board with.
Well,
Yeah.
the
It
title's tough.
Well, yeah,
To
it is, but the movie is literally about a guy that gets you know, rescued by like a demon of some kind and brought back to life just
A
to
woman demon,
a
which
woman
is
demon.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
I mean I
to go
live
on and rape a bunch of people. That's literally his objective is to go around and rape and kill people, for her. So explain. I mean, obviously, I want people to listen to your work off that
mm,
disc, but how do you go about explaining that the films like that to people to where like we kind of touched on a little bit that some people will be completely turned off by something like this just because of what it is,
yep.
but a movie like this where it really goes straight at the thing and it almost feels like the purest form of exploitation you could get on that subject matter. How do you get people to like understand it from a different perspective? That's tough.
I guess for me, and this goes back to my first book, the first edition of the Rape Revenge book. Um, yeah, like I very much realized that I wanted the people that I wanted to talk to, again, they weren't, you know, 60-year-old, 70-year-old professors in universities. I wanted to talk to 15-year-old boys who would watch this stuff. Um, And I'm not going to tell anybody that they need to watch a film called Infernal Rapist. But, you know, I mean, if you're thinking that's actually sounds fucking horrible and I don't want to watch that, I'm not going to tell you that that's wrong. You know, like, of course, like if you have an instinct not to watch a film called that, you know, that pretty much kind of delivers on the luridness of the title, I'm with you. I support you on that decision. The conversation that I guess I want to have is with the people that would watch a film called Infernal Rapist, and to say, you know, you're not degenerate, you know, you're not deviant, that there is stuff going on here. That, I mean, for me, films like that, and I every day I just thank, I'm not religious, but I thank the heavens that I get offered work like that, you know, Vinegar Syndrome, Terrorvision, so many of these amazing labels, that they think to even come to me to have my thoughts on this stuff. Because what so much exploitation film does, and the reason why I'm so passionate about it and I love doing this kind of work, is because it, for better or for worse, it brings things to the surface. I'm a strong believer that not, you know, there's no film, even like a straight to video, you know, low budget, whatever, nothing's made in a vacuum. And every film, often despite itself, even if it's like really low budget, really amateur, whatever, there's stuff in there, you know, there's stuff. And it doesn't mean that, you know, like we need to kind of do, you know, shot by shot analysis. It's like, okay, well, what are the tensions playing out here? What are the hypocrisies? What are the contradictions within this film? And what do they mean? You know, what can they tell us? And what do we, you know, what can we get out of a film called Infernal Rapist if it's the kind of film that we want to watch? And I probably get more feedback from people about films like Infernal Rapist than I do from things like Outrage, or, you know, The Proposition, or you know, Ingmar Bergman. And I love doing that stuff too. I absolutely love doing that stuff. But there's a lot out there, right? Like if you're going to watch, you know, listen to our commentary on Bergman's The Virgin Spring, you're probably already pretty savvy, you know, you're pretty learned and pretty familiar with Bergman. The same doesn't apply to Infernal Rapist. You're not going to, you know, there's not a lot written on it. There's not a lot out there. So yeah, I'm very much about having like a kind of non-judgmental space. But I think, I don't think that, you know, if you want to watch a film called Infernal Rapist, I don't think you're a deviant. And I do think there's lots of stuff going on in that movie. And I think it's an amazing film. It's a challenging film. It's like, it is what it says on the packet. It's very confronting. And I'm not apologizing for it. I'm not defending it. You know, that's very important for me to say that. And it's like, oh, you know, I hate when people do that. Like, are you hard enough to watch this film? My sort of birth into or kind of awakening to exploitation film was as a teenager, was through men who sort of presented it as a dare or a challenge. You know, are you tough enough to watch Faces of Death? And it's really gendered. I know so many women that were the same. And that's how I got into rape revenge film. It's like, actually, this is for me. I don't need you to tell me that, you know, I don't need a man to kind of frame Miss 45 for me. I can watch it on my own terms, in my own way, sort of reclaim that. And I feel the same about Infernal Rapist and those kinds of movies. I can watch them on my own terms and get what I want out of it. And if you don't want to watch those films, that's absolutely fine. And I defend that choice, as I said, you know, like, yeah, not everybody's going to want to watch something like that.
Yeah, I think, you know, what at least the way I think about films like that, where it's like I said, almost purely exploitative. It feels purely exploitative in that it's, you know, kind of maybe even reveling in the violence a little bit and stuff. It even when something is presenting something that terrible in that way, you can get something, you can learn something from how terrible that is. You know what I mean? Like you about what not, you know, things that you don't want to experience in life and in, you know, like, you know what I mean? Like you can get, it's not, you know, not every film is about, you know, gaining some sort of inspiration or learning something positive. It's sometimes about learning something negative.
Not didactic. That's exactly it. It's not every film has to be a quote unquote learning moment, you know? But that's what I love about exploitation film, is that the pretense drops. There's, you know, for better or for worse, they're so honest. They're so honest. And I find that there's mainstream films that are much more exploitative than exploitation films.
Oh yeah. A lot of mainstream films are really trying to manipulate the audience in various ways.
Well, I mean, superhero films by themselves are just, you know, they're basically military movies.
I was going to say, who said it Martin Scorsese said they're like theme park rides, right? You know what I
Yeah, I mean,
mean?
they're just showy,
They're,
you know.
they're there to entertain you and take you on a ride. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's kind
Yeah.
of the way the modern day blockbuster is structured. And it's kind of probably the way it's been structured, at least as long as I've been around.
Yeah.
Through the
And
late '80s and the '90s.
I think that there's a lot. I mean, I'm personally not into superhero films, they're just not my thing, but I think that there's a lot to be said about film as an immersive experience. We
Yeah.
fetishize narrative, and I don't know what to do when people I wrote a book on Dario Argento's Suspiria, and when people say to me, yeah, I don't know, there wasn't much of a story and the characters were really thin, I genuinely don't know what to say to them. It's like, well, yes, but what about all the other stuff? Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
what about
What
the
about the
music?
colors?
I mean, the
Right,
thing is some people they I think with film watching, there's sometimes a translation. People lose the translation of it because film can be communicated in different ways. People they don't know all the languages of film.
Mm,
So a lot of people know straight translation, whether it's like we need
yeah,
a plot we can easily follow or a character we can easily relate with. But sometimes film is communicated with us purely visually or a purely, very subtle way where you have to do some thinking, or you need to watch it a couple times, or there's different ways to tell stories. There's different structures. There's,
yep,
this just
perspectives.
people
Yeah.
don't have that same, they don't key into the language of film as well as I think they might have used to. And maybe I think that's part of that's just because people only watch certain types of movies now, and they're not opening themselves up to watching other things and trying to, try to look at film as more than just escapism or
yeah.
entertainment or,
I
so.
I think too, there's like a personal dimension to that. So I was diagnosed with autism quite late in life, and it was a really useful lens for me to look back at the way that I relate to film. So I've never really, the idea of kind of, and again, to be clear, I'm not saying that this is true of every person who's autistic. Absolutely not. But for me personally, like connecting with character, like I don't understand conversations about identification. It's like, well, I'm
Mm,
not 5. I mean, in broader conversations, like, yes, we should have, more queer people. Well, we should have more people of color. We should have more Black people, Indigenous people. Absolutely. So in terms of identification, in that sense, yes. But in terms of like the personal identification, I don't need to identify with a character on screen to enjoy a film because I'm not a child. Like I just, it
Mm,
bewilders me when people say, well, I didn't have a connection. I didn't identify with anybody.
yeah.
And it's like, look, it's a film set in a German dance school in the 1970s about witches. Maybe you're not meant to connect with anybody.
yeah.
Maybe your
Yeah.
connection is sensorial, and that's how I tend to engage with films, is more on a kind of almost on a visceral gut level way. And Suspiria is like the kind of the
Yeah.
perfect example of that, because
Mm,
it's a
very much so.
sensory experience rather than it is a kind of, the opening song of that film is witch, witch, witch. It's like, oh, I wonder what the mystery of the dance
I
school
mean,
is.
yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, we talked. I brought up Irreversible earlier. I mean, Gaspar Noé's films are all about sensory. God, I
Overload.
mean, tons of his movies are all about sensory overload.
I
Yeah,
mean,
and
I
just
mean, just transition from that. Good, nice setup, Stephen.
rough.
Lux Eterna is all about sensories. There's a sequence in that film where I believe that Gaspar Noé is trying to uh blast our mind into seizure-like state. You know.
I've worked on a lot of home entertainment releases on Gaspar Noé's films. Um, quite a few, quite a few. So I think I did Climax for Arrow, um, Enter the Void for Arrow, Lux Eterna for our friends at Yellow Veil. Hi, Yellow Veil. Um, and there was another one. Oh, Irreversible for Indicator. Um, and I mean, even when I hate his films, I love his films. And he's a
Mhm.
Yeah,
classic example of a filmmaker who I can't defend everything in his films, and I won't. I'm not going to say that. I mean, I think Irreversible has got some serious issues when it comes um, to homophobia, and that
hmm
perhaps feeds into some of his other films. I'm not. I'm not going to do cartwheels to try to twist that to have that not be the case. Like
yeah,
yeah, there's some stuff in that, and obviously, the depiction of rape in that film is is a really
yeah,
difficult thing. Um, but his films always capture me. I've always got something to say about his films, and I
yeah.
think that he understands the sensorium, right? Like he understands
Yeah.
that we engage with film through the body. People like Helen Katat and Bruno Forzani are like that. I think Kino Lorber put out Let the Corpses Tan, which I
Mhm.
did a commentary on with John Edmund. Peter Strickland, Lucille Hasdehalovic, you know, there's these very sensory filmmakers that I love. Like they're like, you know, they're like elevated for me, really
Yeah.
up there.
Yeah,
Vortex. Sorry, I forgot Vortex. I
I
did
was gonna say
Vortex as well.
Vortex is great too, yeah.
Mm. I
That
think
I mean,
I gotta get that release. That
I
release
think
where
of
it pulls out from the middle. Yeah, God, it's
for me, I
yeah.
mean, I think of David Lynch's work, especially his early stuff. I think of you know, Eraserhead, where just there's that constant just sound throughout that film that's just underneath the surface of just setting the scene of this
Yeah.
dystopian dreamlike hellscape that this character is living in.
Yeah, Blue
And
Velvet. Blue Velvet's
Blue
another one.
Velvet's another one. Just the sound of Dennis Hopper breathing through an oxygen mask that's not hooked up
Yeah.
to oxygen. Like, what does that insanity sound like in your mind's eye?
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of his work had that. Even his television show, Twin Peaks, the Angelo Badalamenti score,
Mhm.
haunting to this day. It's haunting yet beautiful at the same time. It's just kind of the magic of music, I guess. I guess that's the purpose of the whole musical scores is to give you certain emotions. We talked about manipulation a little bit ago, and it's like that's kind of what musical scores do.
I
When something,
love. I have such a thing about film scores. Like
mm,
I've recently been watching. I don't know if you've seen Holy Spider, the
Mm-mm.
no,
Ali. I can never remember his name. It's the guy that did Border. He's
Okay.
amazing. It's Holy Spider is like a true Iranian true crime film. But the score is just next level. Like the film is good. He's an amazing filmmaker. But what that
Oh,
score
okay.
does with that film, it's like it makes me really angry at scores that aren't that good. I know that sounds really
Yeah.
terrible,
No,
but
it's like
like
sometimes things come out and you just like they didn't spend enough time on that. They didn't spend enough time. That music is just I think I've heard that soundtrack before. Maybe
people are going to be really angry with me. But I was really disappointed with the score for Bones and All.
I
Like
still haven't seen it
oh,
yet. Yeah.
I think
interesting.
Reznor I think is an amazing composer for films, but that one it really fell flat for me.
Okay.
I was very disappointed, and I think it impacted my feelings about the film as a whole. I think with a different score, that could have been something really different.
It
Oh,
is. I
people are
mean,
going to go nuts at me. You
I
can't
know.
shit on
it'd
Trent
be
I
all
Reznor.
doubt
right.
it. I
I've said a lot worse things.
yeah, Steven has had a
Trent
few
Reznor won't.
hot
I
takes.
think that he can live with it. I think that he'll be
It'd be
fine. And if I
fine.
say, "Yeah, dude, it's not my favorite of your work," I reckon he'll be okay.
The direct David Lynch connection there because Trent Reznor was in the Twin Peaks: The Return, where
Yeah,
he did a whole song in one of
and
the
his great
episodes.
work on the Lost Highway soundtrack was
Yes,
amazing.
he did. I mean, yeah, Trent Reznor, he made the transition from, I guess, musical artist to musical composing, which I
Composer.
guess
I mean,
is
he's doing
not
both.
that. Yeah, he's doing both. I mean,
But I do want.
Clint Mansell as well. I think Clint Mansell's like
yes.
underrated. I think that
Yeah.
Clint was in a band called Pop or Eat Itself, who I skipped my high school formal to see underage to go to a Pop or
Nice.
Eat Itself gig. So I have this sort of connection to
Yeah.
Clint Mansell that
That's
he
that's a
doesn't know
rebellious
about.
move. I like
Yeah,
it.
and I think he's I mean, I love Pop or Eat Itself, but his film score work I think is next level and just unrelentingly good.
Yeah.
I think he's such an underrated film composer.
Yeah, he did, I believe, didn't he do the score for Drive, right? Or am I
No,
thinking of somebody else?
that was somebody else. Clint did
Oh,
Pi, I think is probably
oh, yes,
his
Clint
really famous
has
one.
worked a lot with
Oh, and
Aronofsky.
Requiem for a Dream,
Yes,
Yeah.
the
there we
famous
Yeah.
go.
that's
I'm
like his big
thinking
one.
I'm thinking of somebody else. I don't know why
Yeah.
I was in that Drive mode for a second. Yeah, Clint Mansell did work a lot with Aronofsky. Yeah, Working for a Dream. Even if you haven't seen the film, talk about a traumatic film in many ways. Um, it's you've probably heard the score many times. For those of you listening, it's one that gets stuck in your head. Yeah, I was thinking of Cliff Martinez.
Yep.
That's why
Yeah.
Cliff Martinez did the Drive soundtrack.
Yeah.
Uh,
But
uh,
I do want to talk about we said you've done a lot of commentaries and you do a lot of commentaries with a friend of yours, Josh Nelson. So talk about that how that partnership kind of started because you've done a lot of them with him.
Yeah, so Josh and I did radio together in Melbourne for years. We were on a show called Plato's Cave on public radio here, a really famous sort of quite iconic Melbourne public radio station called Triple R. And it was with our friend Thomas Caldwell, who has work on a few home entertainment releases. He's got a video essay, I think, on the upcoming Second Sight Picnic at Hanging Rock. Thomas is an amazing film critic and a beautiful person. And Cerise Howard, who does, she's really doing a lot of work in home entertainment now. She's incredible. She did, I think, the commentary on Tangerine, which is really good, a really great commentary. And I think she's on the Texas Chainsaw from Second Sight coming up.
We know you're on that too as well. So
yeah, so Cerise is doing amazing work. But Josh moved to the United States in, I think, 2016, 2017. And we just missed doing radio together. That was sort of the way that we hung out. And I don't think it was even a conscious thing, like, let's do a lot of commentaries together. I think I didn't even remember what our first one was. But I remembered, like, I miss talking to Josh about film. And so in a way, it's sort of replaced our, it's like a way to catch up. And I love it.
That's great.
I love doing commentaries with Josh because I kind of get nostalgic for the old days. And yeah, like our whole friendship was sort of always predicated about talking about film. So it feels very natural and very organic.
So is it weird when you do one by yourself? You just
totally different experience. Totally different experience. No, I'd always prefer to do one with Josh. Always.
Do you find it easier to do a commentary with someone else versus yourself in the sense of, like, shared responsibility, camaraderie, and like it's just an easier experience?
It depends on the film. There's a couple that haven't been announced yet that I've done solo that I'm really glad that I did solo. And certainly that applies to, things that I've done in the past. I'm really glad that I did them by myself because there's either a personal dimension or there's a particular kind of line that I want to follow through on, or something like Outrage, where it's like, it's such a deep research interest of mine that I can really kind of get into the guts of it by myself. So it does depend on the film.
Yeah.
But certainly, even just as a listener, I find that it tends to be more engaging listening to two people chat than it does listening to one person in monotone. Like, it does tend to be a little bit drier. You feel a bit weird making jokes when you're talking by yourself. You feel like a little bit of a psycho. Whereas if it's two people, you get, banter. And that's when a commentary for me works the best, is when you've got this sort of informed banter. It can be very high energy. One of my favorite commentaries, and it was oddly very for all of the stuff that I've done, this was probably the most controversial in terms of, like, Twitter outrage. I still can't believe this. It wasn't Infernal Rapist. It wasn't Thriller. It was Cool as Ice, the Vanilla Ice film. And to this day, people were like, how dare this be out on Blu-ray? How dare it? And it's like, well, fair call. Like, I don't know. But
gatekeeping's an issue when it comes to,
people like, these critics are made up. They don't even exist. Who the hell are they? How humiliating for them. And I still think it's one of the best commentaries that Josh and I ever did. And I don't read reviews ever. And I have good friends, Bill Ackerman, shout out, who send me good reviews because they know that I don't read them. Because that way madness lies. But we got great reviews for Cool as Ice. And we were really proud of it. Like, we worked really hard on it because it was actually a really hard film to talk about. Because people sort of, it's like, it's a joke film, and we didn't want to do the kind of so bad it's good thing. But at the same time, you can't do this is one of the greatest films of the 20th century. So like a film like that, there's no way that I could have done that by myself. So, with Josh, it was perfect. And that still remains one of my favorite commentaries that I've done.
Yeah, that's for a movie like that. Yeah, it's good to be able to talk about it with it. Them are movies you watch with friends. So it's good to talk about it with friends. And that's, and also, I do want to make sure I bring up, and kind of reverting back to our previous discussion on rape films. We did get a chance to watch a recent thing that just got announced, Gina, that Canadian International Pictures just announced. And so I want to shout out to Jonathan over there who sent me a link to watch the film, send us both a link to watch the film and watch your visual essay on it. So I just want to say, great film. I really enjoyed it. And also your visual essay was really informative and helped me kind of understand some of the background things that I didn't notice. Like, for instance, we kind of talked about it before, in the rape scene itself, there is like the Canadian, like, national anthem song playing in the back. I was like, I didn't even notice that.
It's
Wow,
crazy.
yeah.
So I wrote about that. I mean, companies like CIP, I think, are a really good example of what I was talking about before in doing this, like, really important, fundamental archival work, and getting it out there, and not getting it out there to a limited elite, getting it out there to people that love movies. I mean, it's such important work. And again, I don't think any of the people that work for these companies would be as kind of, as highfalutin perhaps as I am about it. But I just think they're in the trenches, finding these films, saving these films, rescuing these films. Not just that, but getting them out there for people to see. Gina is a treasure. I mean, it's a film. It's one of the first films I think that Kayla Janice and I first connected on, and Kayla does a commentary with Justine. I've gone blank on Justine's surname. Please tell me. I feel awful. Amazing film critic, Canadian, wonderful woman.
I'm looking it up right now to save you.
Well, they
Come
do a
on, browser,
commentary.
don't fail me now.
They do a commentary. I do a video essay, and for me, like, having a feature on a release like this with somebody of Kayla's kind of caliber is incredible. So yeah, that release to me is it's like a textbook case of why physical media, why home entertainment is so vital and so important.
Yeah, the person that you were referring to was Justine Smith.
Justine, I'm so sorry.
Oh, actually, I think I have another one of your work on my shelf. I think you did an interview for the Australian edition of Raw from a few years ago, and I ran because for some reason in the United States they didn't decide to release that movie on Blu-ray until like 4 or 5 years after it came out, and I was like, I need to get this on Blu-ray from somewhere. So I was like, I just found Australia was releasing it, and I ended up buying it, and lo and behold, years later, there it is on my shelf with an
That was
interview for you.
for Monster Films.
From Monster, yes.
Yeah, and that was the year so I interviewed Julia, the year that Kayla Janice was the creative director of Monster Fest. She got Julia out here, and I interviewed her in like a cinema stairwell.
Oh, that must have been incredible.
It was amazing. But a lot of those extras got picked up, and then they added new content for the second site release.
Yes,
I think I did a video essay. Yeah, I did a separate video essay for that. I'm not sure. I think a couple of the commentaries, one of the commentaries, maybe a commentary with Emma Westwood got used for that with Julia. I'm not sure from memory, but yeah, I don't do a lot of work in Australia at all. I started off doing this stuff so around 2000 and maybe it's 2006, 2007. My first home entertainment release was doing an essay for Ingmar Bergman's Dreams.
Oh, wow.
For Mad Men's Director's Suite. And I also did a commentary with Christian McRae on Fassbinder's The Merchant of the Four Seasons.
Oh, yeah.
And that's actually been picked up by, since then, that's been picked up by Arrow. So
Arrow, they released it in a whole big box. They released it in smaller boxes. They released it a few times.
So
I know
that commentary's got a lot of legs, yeah.
Yeah, and here in the States, we got I think a Blu-ray from Criterion the years before that.
It's such a good film. Fassbinder's one of my favorite
directors. Unique director. He did a lot of work in a very short amount of time.
My favorite Cocaine Bear. He went hard. For better or for worse, the dude went hard.
Yes, he did. I mean, what's that old saying? Better to burn out than fade away, I guess,
Yep.
Yeah, he was working on a film, I think, up until he passed. I think he was in the middle of working on stuff.
He was so prolific, and even his sort of lesser known films, you just watch them and it's like, this is insane.
Oh,
like,
his early
what am I
work,
watching?
markedly different too.
Yep.
Yep. I know Criterion had released an Eclipse set of his earlier stuff, like kind of on DVD, and like it just incredible work. Very experimental.
One of my favorites. Just one of my favorites. I just don't think he's ever been paralleled.
I don't think he gets talked about enough, honestly.
No.
I mean, especially when it comes to the way they teach foreign cinema, at least here, you always hit the main people. You always get to the French New Wave. That's in every curriculum. We were talking about academia. French New Wave seems to be in every curriculum for foreign cinema. I started with To me, Italian neorealism was my real introduction to foreign cinema and the power of foreign cinema. Um, like Rossellini and
Mm.
Vittorio De Sica. Yet again, I still think Bicycle Thieves is film school 101.
Yep.
I think that's taught in every film course in the world.